thank you everyone for attending. I know everyone's very busy. It is great to have you here. This is a very important dialogue that we're about to have with the Shadow Minister for Climate Change, Chris Bowen. Hopefully not the last conversation we will have with a climate change minister or spokesperson before the election, whenever that is held. Obviously, just as a few opening comments, this week's IPCC report is another very concerning piece of advice from our scientists. It tells us that we need that rapid acceleration of emission reductions to have any chance of keeping below 1.5 degrees. We do need to see emissions peak by 2025 and be reduced to 43% by 2030. And there is no greater illustration of climate disruption and climate chaos than what we're seeing on the East Coast for the last 2 years with both fires and floods. And I just want to pay my respects to any of the elected members here today from communities that are in the middle of these climate fueled extreme events. So we do need the next federal government to accelerate that action and take a national leadership role. And local governments and working with local governments really is the secret weapon for the next federal government to do more on climate change. We are the natural partners in meeting the challenge of climate change. Some work done by ICLEI last year showed that ICLEI and GCOM, I think it was, showed that if the emission reductions that are planned by just 61 of the 537 local governments, if those 61 plans are met, it will actually deliver 91,000 tonnes of CO2 emissions. And that would bring Australia halfway to meeting its 43% reduction target by 2030. So we do need assistance to make our plans a reality and to make those plans a reality faster, and that's where working with the federal government and having a much stronger national NDC would be a really important step. On the resilience and adaptation side of things, clearly there's also no time to lose, and we need to stop leaving it to local governments to mop up the mess after the fact. We need to build strength and resilience and prevention into our communities and into our infrastructure. Today's roundtable and the fantastic attendance is growing evidence of the coalition that's building amongst local government leaders. More than 200 councils, accounting for 90% of Australia's population, are committed to climate action through a range of groups and networks, including the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, ICLEI Oceania, Local Governments for Sustainability, and the Better Futures Australia networks. I think we'd all agree that the work that we all do on climate change in the next decade is some of the most important work, or in fact the most important work we will do in our professional careers. It will be challenging, it will be difficult, we will face opposition, but the reward for the work that we do on climate change is a safer future for our communities, and that is the most important goal that we can strive for. Before we hear from Shadow Minister Chris Bowen, I would like to also just request on behalf of the group here today that we have an in-person mayoral roundtable in mid-June if Chris is the elected minister in June, and that would be to discuss how we enable a federal-local partnership. And we'd also invite the next Minister for Climate Change to join a high-level event on multi-level action at COP27 to announce the federal government's commitments to support local governments in Australia and across the Oceania region. So thank you for allowing me to provide some opening remarks, and I'd now like to hand over to the Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Mr. Chris Bowen. Thank you, Chris.
Excuse me, Shadow Minister, you would need to... Thank you.
All good. Thank you. I think I pressed unmute twice, so I re-muted myself. Thank you very much, Mayor, for the invitation to join you, and thank you for joining us in such big numbers from around the country. I also want to acknowledge the fact that I'm speaking to you from the land of the Gadigal people, And from where I'm sitting, I can see the place where Barangaroo and her husband Benong saw 11 ships sail around the Sydney Heads 234 years ago, and their lives and the lives of their people changed forever, which must be recognised. And it is well beyond time that our First Nations people had a constitutionally enshrined voice to the Australian Parliament, which a government that I hope to be a member of will deliver as part of our agenda. Well, I was very keen to accept your invitation for a number of reasons. As one of the small handful of former mayors in the House of Representatives, I very much celebrate and embrace partnership between the Commonwealth and local government, and in no area more than in my portfolio of climate change. There is too much to do for any one level of government to do it alone. I don't intend to be too partisan in my comments today. This is probably the last working day before a federal election is called, but it's my very strong view that the first step to giving the country a climate change policy which works and we can be proud of, and which seizes the opportunities, the economic opportunities that are the world's climate emergency in Australia. The first step is a federal government, which gets the framework and sets the policy agenda. That's the first step and an essential step, but it is far from the last step. There is too much to do, and we need to get this done all in. All levels of government, industry, unions, communities, we need to be all in. We don't have the luxury of an either or approach. We could do this or we could do that. We have to have an ampersand approach, an and approach, i.e. we're going to do this and that and that and that. And that requires a very close collaboration amongst the levels of government. I've seen around the country the good work that local government is doing on my journeys, and certainly your National President, Linda Scott, has briefed me, and I've seen it firsthand as I visit different communities, what they're doing. I've been up on the roof of council chambers, which have been turned into solar farms. I've been to electric car charging stations run by local government. It's fair to say I've seen a good gamut of the work that local government is doing. And we're going to need to do more of it. And I see states and territories as well as local government currently, frankly, filling a void. In a vacuum of national leadership, local government and state governments are getting on with the job, which I very much welcome. However, I do want to provide a better framework for that work to occur. I want to provide an opportunity for that work to occur as part of a more consistent national approach. And so if we do come first on May 21st, one of the first things I would do is convene a meeting of my state and territory colleagues, state and territory energy and climate change minister colleagues, to get on the same table. And it would certainly be my intention to invite a representative of local government to that meeting as well through the ALGA. That would be my very clear intention, because I see federal and local government together with our state and territory colleagues as key partners in getting this job done. There are several elements of our policy which have a strong community focus. We released our climate policy on December the 3rd. There are several elements of that policy which engage a strong community focus, whether it is our community batteries policy, empowering communities to be part of the task of storing renewable energy. Opponents of renewable energy say the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, which is true. But it's about as relevant as saying the rain doesn't always fall, so we can't rely on water. These things, we store water, we can store renewable energy, and community batteries are an important part of that. We've begun announcing a rollout of community batteries, but there will also be a program in government where we will call for expressions of interest for communities who wish to host community batteries. So I would certainly encourage you and your councils to be ready, if you are so inclined, to bid for a community battery under that competitive process that we will engage in soon after coming to office. We also have a solar banks policy, which is the policy of establishing solar arrays to be accessed by people who can't have solar panels on their roof for whatever reason. They might be renters, they might be low socioeconomic, they might live in a shady street where just simply solar panels don't work. They'll be able to participate in a community-run program where a solar bank will be established that they can, it'll effectively be a solar array on the roof. It'll just be located somewhere else. Doesn't need to be physically located where they are. They'll often be in the regions because of the space necessary. Unlike a community battery, which will be in the community that accesses it, the solar banks will be spread around the country. But these are elements of the community focus. We have the big, policies around safeguard mechanism, rewiring the nation that are national in scope, but we also very much recognise the community focus for it as well. So my main message this morning, and what I wanted to keep as a relatively brief remarks, because there are plenty of people around the table, I want to leave an opportunity for a conversation, is that local government would be a key partner for us should we win the election. As I said, I'm a former mayor myself. I spent 9 years in local government, so I understand the power of local solutions. I understand the power of a council engaging in tackling the world's climate emergency. As the old saying goes, think global, act local. Well, nobody can act local like local government. So getting the policy framework right will be the first step. Then there'll be a lot more to do. I would be very keen to accept your invitation, Madam Mayor. If we do proceed to win the election, I will accept your invitation for a personal meeting in June, subject to diary and making it work. But it's a yes. We will make it work to do that, because that will be important. But as I said, local government will also be invited to the first meeting, which I'll convene, within days of coming to office, with the state and territory energy and climate change ministers, to try and get a better national framework for this most important national task. Better climate change policy will be a signature of the Albanese Labor government. Will be one of our signature reforms when our time in office comes to an end in 10 or 15 years' time, is the plan. But if we manage to do that, and people say, what was the Albanese government remembered for? Fixing climate change, ending the 20 years of toxic politics, ending the terrible debates about climate change. We do want to be one of our signature reforms. Of course, we first have to win. It's a hard task. It's like climbing Mount Everest. This is a really tight election. I'm not going to be partisan in these comments. This is really tight. We have a long way to go. But if we do happen to win the election, the people on this call will be key partners for us when it comes to climate action. I leave my remarks there and look forward to discussion today and going forward.
Thanks so much, Chris. Now we have an opportunity for questions. I don't see any hands up just yet, but I might see if Linda Scott, the president of ALGA, would like to have the honour of the first question.
So much, Lord Mayor. It's so great that ALGA's been able to partner with ICLEI, and we're so grateful for the leadership of ICLEI. And thanks also, Chris. We really appreciate having all our mayors in federal government. So it is great to have you in there with a deep understanding of local government and also a commitment to act on this really important issue. Can I just acknowledge that it is great that you have been to see the work that local governments are doing, because it's so different in different areas. And I know we've got mayors right from around the nation, and councillors and deputy mayors. And I do think it is really important to understand that diversity, because there's so many different requirements and different needs. And really, as we have been advocating to both the government and the opposition, it's a question of funding. Councils are just, as you would know, limited by funding. Do you have any specific funding allocations that you are committing to as the Labor proposed government for specific local government actions to mitigate against dangerous climate change?
Thank you, Linda. Well, firstly, as I said, I see local government as a key partner in several ways, in several mechanisms. Community batteries are something that local government will participate in, inevitably. They'll be run by network operators, but in almost all circumstances, we'll be asking local government to host the community battery, because it needs to be on a plot of public land away from a house, because they can be just a little bit noisy. So you don't want them, right about it next to a house. In terms of other funding streams, we do have our Powering the Regions Fund and our National Reconstruction Fund, which are both, neither of which are specific to local government. Far from it. We see them as being key partners with industry and decarbonisation, but it will be open to local government to participate in both those funds and to put bids in for funding under both of those funds. Powering the Regions, are more regional focused than a city focused, but certainly the National Reconstruction Fund as well. The National Reconstruction Fund will have to be run in a way which are sound investments and return to government, but I do see a scope for local government to participate in the very real transformation that's underway there. And then, look, what we need to do is change the government and have a government which gets it, and then we can begin a sensible national conversation about what more we can do together, instead of the toxic politics of division that we've encountered for too long.
Thanks, Chris. The next question comes from Deputy Mayor of the Blue Mountains, Romola Hollywood.
Hi, thanks very much, Lord Mayor. Thank you, Chris Bowen, Shadow Minister, for your really encouraging words. My question relates to the impacts of climate change that we're experiencing right now. Many local councils, including our own in the Blue Mountains, are experiencing the direct impacts of climate change with more frequent and more extreme weather events. We've experienced the Black Summer fires, torrential rain and flooding, and for the last 3 years, and as we speak, we are going through it. These extreme weather events are taking an enormous toll on our communities, our built infrastructure and our natural environment. And we're facing massive repair bills that are beyond the scope of our own infrastructure budgets. But the key question is, because this damage is due to the impact of climate change, we know we simply can't repair our infrastructure to the same standards that it was built 40 or 50 years ago. So as part of taking action on climate change, what are your plans, Labor's plans, to support local councils to build back better, to mitigate and withstand the effects of climate change on our communities?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. And I was in your fine city yesterday announcing 2 community batteries, one for Blaxland East and one for Hobartville. So, and then we did a wonderful community forum in Katoomba with about 150 of your local residents.
Thank you.
Yes, your question is absolutely spot on. Unfortunately, as well as mitigation, we need to deal with adaptation. Unfortunately, because the world has left it too late, it has warmed. It is now a question of whether we can hold the world to 1.5 degrees of warming, but we've already warmed by 1.1, and that 1.1 has already had an impact. We used to say, you can't sheet any particular natural disaster home to climate change, but I don't accept that anymore. Now, unfortunately, we have to say these disasters are happening more often and are more severe because of climate change. Once in 100-year floods are happening once every 10 years. That's just a statement of reality. So resilience and adaptation has to be part of the agenda as well. Again, federal and local government working together is a key part of that. We have committed to spend at least $200 million a year out of the Emergency Response Fund, which already exists, but not a dollar has been spent. It's existed for quite some time, which is just, we think, ridiculous. And much of that money does need to be spent in consultation with local government. We also need to consider the impact of climate change on our planning rules. Again, is primarily a matter for state and local government, but one in which we would have an interest in partnering in a sensible discussion on. So the key point is I agree with your fundamental starting point, that local government needs to be a key partner on resilience and adaptation as well as mitigation.
Thank you. Next question is from Mayor of Brimbank, Jasmine Nguyen.
Hi, Chris. How are you? Hi, I'm Jasmine from Brimbank. Lovely to meet you. Now, my question to you is, we're first of all very grateful to meet up with you today, particularly during such a busy period in the lead up to the election. I want to acknowledge here that municipalities such as those in Melbourne's West not only experience a significant level of disadvantage, but have also been neglected with a record of underinvestment by the federal government. For example, in Brimbank, we've only received just $800,000 in funding for the last 3 financial years. And I'm just pointing out here that we have one of the lowest tree canopies, highest death rate for COVID in Victoria. If elected, what would federal Labor do in considering investment in local projects to support disadvantaged communities in our endeavours to tackle climate change? And if so, what would such projects look like?
Well, thanks, Jasmine. Thanks, Mayor. I agree with you, and I think I get that. I was mayor of a Western Sydney city, and dealing with many of the exact issues that you're referring to in the suburbs of Melbourne, and we are very much on the same page. And I think the question really goes beyond climate change to broader support for areas of disadvantage, although it is related to climate change and again related to Deputy Mayor Hollywood's question, because it's partly about the impacts of climate change on disadvantaged areas, which will frankly worsen disadvantage. You know, we're adding 1 day of heat wave to Australia every 5 years. And I don't mean to be melodramatic, but that costs lives in areas like ours, where many homes don't have air conditioning, we don't have the natural shady canopies in the broad expanse of Western Melbourne and Western Sydney. So that's just a statement of fact. And that needs to be reflected, I think, in government support more broadly. We will have a national climate change health strategy, which I think obviously will be developed in government, but I think areas of disadvantage will have to be a key element of that, and support for areas of disadvantage, because there's hardly a problem in Australia that climate change won't make worse, but existing entrenched disadvantage is probably highest amongst that.
Thanks, Chris. The next question is from Deputy Mayor Jack Ritchie, Deputy Mayor of Port Lincoln.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to raise a question as well. I'm probably following along from the same line that others have taken as well, is the question about the opportunity that exists, given that there's 200 councils who are supporting action on climate change, and that opportunity to partner refunding. And you've said that's very much the focus that you're looking at. To me, I see that there's a huge opportunity there with that direct funding to local governments, broader than the other two funds you mentioned, where those councils can, who already have the policies in place, put those projects that they want to do but are not really resourced to do into action. And I'm just hoping that that's something you can consider adding to that platform of funding that you're talking about.
Sure, and I guess that, again, that's an area where the Powering the Regions Fund, particularly in relation to your local government area, might be a useful source. But sure, I know that every local government has good plans in the top drawer which are unfunded, and all it needs is to add a little bit of funding to make them a reality. So I certainly recognise that, and I'm sure that there will be opportunities across government to make some of those a reality.
Thanks, Chris. We've now got a question from Mayor Greg Christensen from the Scenic Rim Regional Council. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you, and good morning, Chris. We've talked previously with some of the Council of Mayors conversations from South East Queensland, but it's probably two key issues. One, firstly, the UN recognises that the land management and recovery of our waterways, recovery of our forests is a critical part of managing climate change effects, whatever you believe their source is, and ensuring that we have proper sustainable future. And that also ties in with sustainable food production and a move towards regenerative land management. I'd like to understand where those elements sit in the policy. A lot of the conversation has focused around the power generation and the impacts in urban areas. We're a very large distributed regional council, and we are custodians of two of those critical aspects, both environmental precincts and food production. And the second piece to the question is very much around the intent around the zero waste to landfill strategy, which we have in South East Queensland more generally, and what the thoughts are about investment in that as part of also reducing the impact. As we know, landfill creates negative impacts in the carbon discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. The second question is one that I obviously have an interest in, but it's not actually in my portfolio. It's in the environment portfolio in our setup. I'm the Shadow Minister for Climate Change, not the Shadow Minister for the Environment, although they are very, very closely related, and I work very closely with Terry Butler, who is obviously a Brisbane MP as well as the Shadow Minister for the Environment, will be Minister for the Environment under our government. And but the policy driver in landfill is held in her hands. So perhaps we could certainly make that introduction if that's helpful, if you haven't already met or interacted with Terry. In relation to land use and food production and agriculture, yes, it is a key area. Again, I think agriculture is one of those areas which used to be seen as a potential cost. An area, a sector which will pay the price of action on climate change. That's no longer the case. It was never the case in reality, but it's no longer even the perception. There's real opportunities. Storing more carbon in soil leads to more productivity and to richer and better soils. So there's absolutely no question about that. And it's got to be a key part of the embroidery of climate policy. Where our policy probably most interacts with land and food production and agriculture is through the carbon trading market, carbon credit market, which will become more important under us because we are going to reform. I won't sort of bore you with the finer details, but we're going to reform the safeguards mechanism, which applies to big industry, and that'll generate more investment in offsets through safeguard credits. And this is an area which intersects with agriculture very, 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 very closely. We'll also conduct a fairly short review of carbon credits to ensure that the system is working with integrity. There's been you may have seen some recent media about this, but I've had those concerns longer than that, and this review was announced in December. But the other thing that review will look at is things like biodiversity, ensuring that carbon credit trading is not encouraging monoculture, that we're encouraging biodiversity that's leading to real and meaningful emissions reduction and avoiding land clearing that in reality would have occurred, not alleged land clearing that might not have occurred. So all these things will be covered by our independent but short and sharp review, and I think there is much more to do in relation to all those issues. And agriculture, is a key beneficiary of action on climate change. Farm productivity is down, farm profits are down, the quality of the land is degrading because of climate change, but agriculture can be a big beneficiary of properly designed policy in relation to climate change.
Thank you. Next question is from Mayor Mazelos from the City of Waverley.
Thank you, Anna. And Chris, thank you for the opportunity to be able to ask you some questions today. At Waverley Council, we're only a small community, but we're one of the most densely populated LGAs in Australia, hosting Bondi Beach, amongst others. We've actually declared, well, a couple of years ago, we actually declared a climate emergency, a biodiversity emergency. We put council onto a net zero emissions target of 2030 2 years ago, and as of early this year, we have put our community target net zero emissions 2035. So we're really making climate change an issue that is front and centre. However, we are actually seeing more and more destructive events, certainly as Romola had indicated, but for us it's more East Coast lows, flooding. We keep getting significant damage along all our coastal areas. A couple of years ago, we received very significant damage, millions of dollars, and we were declared a natural disaster. However, we didn't receive any money from the federal government, bar $200,000, which came a year or two after the event. And certainly the insurance companies were not prepared to foot the bill either. This is going to become an increasing problem for us because, again, we can't keep funding this devastation. And we can't, so I'm just wondering what the federal government and your policy, should you win government, Chris, what you will be looking at doing to ensure that the insurance sector is going to be able to actually help fund and mitigate the effects of climate change, because we can't keep funding this level of destruction.
Thank you, Paula, and I certainly understand the issues and that you identify, and certainly understand how your community has been at the front line of some of those issues. I've seen that myself from my visits to your city with yourself and with Councillor Tim Murray and others. I guess my answer is similar to, I think, my answer to the Deputy Mayor of Blue Mountains in relation to the Emergency Response Fund. It's not a term deposit, it should be invested. And by invested, I mean spent in communities. And we would spend at least $200 million of that each year on those sorts of projects. I'm not going to make a promise I can't keep. I can't particularly help you with the insurance question. That's a longer conversation for the country to be had at various levels of government and with the insurance industry. I'm not going to pretend that I have a magic bullet there, but working on those sorts of things through the Emergency Response Fund, I think is the key difference that a federal government can make.
Thank you. Next question is from Mayor Binks from the Strathbogie Shire Council.
Thank you, Anna. Hello, Chris. Thanks for joining us today. A lot of my questions have sort of already been asked in different ways, so it's possibly kind of touching on something again. But we're in quite a different shire. We're not densely populated. We've got a huge area, but we have real commitment from our community to see action on climate change, not just policy. So I guess I'm really interested to understand how you, as the federal government, will help our local councils actually enact action rather than just leave it at the policy level. We've got a real strong mandate from our community, to see that action being enacted. So just really interested to see what sort of on ground investments, etc. you'd be, yeah.
Thank you. Look, I think the best way of answering that is to think about some of the synergies that might be possible amongst the different policy, suite of policy measures that we would implement. So one quick example, for example, in Hobson's Bay in Victoria, where I hopped up on the roof of the council chambers and looked at their solar array, which they put on their roof. While doing that, announced that we would install a community battery because that solar power that they are generating is not being stored. It's powering things during the day, excess is being fed into the grid, and there is no benefit for the council in the evening because they couldn't justify the cost of a battery because they are just so expensive. But they're a community battery, which the residents will also be able to participate in, but the council can participate in. Would work very well with what they've done. Another example is when I announced a community battery in South Bank, a very different local government area. It's in the city of Melbourne itself, where there's actually very low take-up of solar so far because they all live in apartments and stratas and are renters, but they are absolutely desperate to participate in renewable energy because they care about they want to make the transition away from being on the grid, but it's just very hard when you live in such a dense community. And there, I'm quite sure, and I'd already discussed it with the Deputy Lord Mayor of the City of Melbourne, that some of the council buildings could be engineered to participate in the community batteries so that the renewable energy is being generated off council roofs but feeding into a community battery which residents can access in the evening. So that there are many synergies. There's just a couple of examples in our policy so far, and look, I'm sure there's more which councils themselves will come up with. So, for example, there's nothing stopping when a community battery is up and running, a council participating in that to help them if they choose to participate in electric vehicle charging infrastructure rollouts, for example. There's all sorts of things which, when you take the whole suite together, hang together quite nicely and enable local government to, in some instances, piggyback off federal government investments, and in other incidents, federal government sort of coming in and really just complementing and finishing the job the local government has started.
Thanks, Chris. Look, we've only got time now for one more question. I'm going to invite Mayor Fitzharding from City of Fremantle for our final question or comment, and then I'll hand over to Councillor Amanda Stone from City of Yarra, who will make some closing remarks. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I hope this is the start of a much deeper dialogue between the federal government and local government. Thank you, Mayor Fitzharding.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks, Chris, for the opportunity to have this conversation. Hopefully we'll be having one later in person later on in the year. I met with the Royal Institute of Architects the other day with a view to us incorporating at a local government level life cycle assessment for carbon in planning approvals, which is a great idea and something that we're really open to. But really, I think the view is that if we do this at local government level, it's to put pressure on the federal government to look at the National Construction Code and really see how we can decarbonise the building industry. We're in the middle of another construction boom here in Western Australia. I understand 40% of carbon emissions come from the construction industry, whether that's buildings, whether that's moving materials, whether that's the act of constructing, whether it's poorly designed buildings that aren't very efficient. So I'm interested if Labor is elected, whether the National Construction Code will be on the table and whether we can really use that as a lever to capture what are effectively the low-hanging fruit in carbon emissions. Thanks.
Thank you. I was just thinking about that question a little bit. I think that's a well-placed question, a well-put question. I think that's got to be seen as part of a broader consideration of things like, not directly related to what you've asked, but I think relevant to what you've asked, the National Construction Code, which I do think is in need of reform and updating and better engagement with these questions. I think that it's frankly not fit for purpose at the moment, and how we would require consideration about electric vehicle charging infrastructure alongside the issue you raise, which I think is a very valid one. And I think you're right. I think you put it well that local government might play a role there, but only if it's part of a broader framework. So you've actually given me a little bit to think about with that particular question about whole of life carbon cycles. It is reflected in our approach, but I think there's inevitably going to be more to do.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shadow Minister Bowen, for your responses. I do hope that Amanda Stone is now available to wrap up.
I am, and a thank you from me too on behalf of ICLEI Oceania and all our partners who've put together today. It's clear from the questions that haven't been able to be asked that we could have had much more time, but everyone is time pressed and we really value the time you spent with us today. To those who haven't been able to ask their questions, there is no agenda here. We just have run out of time. There were some questions placed beforehand, so please put those unasked questions in the chat and we will make them available to everybody. ICLEI Oceania and the Global Covenant of Mayors are dedicated to accelerating climate action with courage and great determination to take leadership on this great problem of our time, which is obviously on everyone's minds here today. Following the election, we will be working extremely hard to establish the partnership with the federal government that Chris Bowen has committed to today, which is fabulous to hear, and all levels of government, as he has also articulated. And we will also be hosting a high-level event on this multi-level action at COP27 in Kunming to make today's discussions a reality. So that's something to look forward to. And a recording and a summary of today's events, including the chat, will be circulated next week. So once more, thank you to everyone for participating today. We know how important a topic this is. It's great to have a commitment from Chris Bowen to this multi-level governance and action that we also desperately need. And please keep up the wonderful work that you are all doing on behalf of your communities for a zero carbon world. Thank you.